It was a cold October night when Lisa Carter decided to take the long stretch of Highway 99 back home to Fresno. The road was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of her Honda Accord breaking the silence. The moonlight bathed the deserted highway in a pale glow, and the occasional road sign flickered in the distance. Warped by the chill air, Lisa was halfway through her 2-hour drive when she noticed a pair of headlights behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. It was normal to see the odd car even on this deserted stretch of road. But as the minutes passed, the car didn't overtake her. It stayed at an unsettlingly close distance, mimicking her speed. She glanced in her rearview mirror and noticed the car was an old pickup truck, its rusty exterior barely visible under the dim glow of its headlights. Lisa's unease grew when the truck flashed its high beams at her. Startled, she switched lanes, expecting the vehicle to pass. But instead, the truck followed suit, remaining directly behind her. Her heartbeat quickened. She pressed her foot on the gas, speeding up to put distance between her and the truck. For a brief moment, she thought it had worked. The headlights grew smaller in her mirror. But just as she felt a wave of relief, the truck accelerated, quickly closing the gap. Lisa's palms were slick with sweat as she gripped the wheel tightly. She grabbed her phone, ready to call 911, but her signal was gone, just an empty bar where service should have been. Ahead, she spotted a gas station, its flickering neon sign reading, "Rest Stop Open 24/7. It looked run down but seemed like her only hope. She swerved onto the exit ramp, tires screeching as she pulled into the lot. The truck followed her. She parked near the dimly lit entrance and ran inside, her heart pounding in her ears. The attendant, an older man with tired eyes, looked up from his counter. "Something wrong, miss?" he asked, noticing her pale face. "A truck hits following me," she stammered, pointing out the window. The man stepped out to look, but the parking lot was empty. The truck was gone. "You sure?" he asked, his brows furrowing. Lisa nodded, trembling, but when she turned back toward her car, her blood ran cold. Scratched into the driver's side door were the words, "Don't look back." The attendant frowned, noticing Lisa's shaken state. "Stay here a moment," he said, reaching under the counter for a flashlight. He stepped outside to examine her car, motioning for her to stay put. Lisa hovered near the door, her heart pounding as she scanned the empty parking lot. The faint sound of crickets filled the silence, but the truck was nowhere in sight. She tried to steady her breathing, convincing herself it might have been some prank by a reckless driver. After a few moments, the attendant came back inside, shaking his head. "The scratches are fresh, but I didn't see anyone out there. Might have been kids messing around." "Kids? On a highway in the middle of the night?" Lisa's voice quivered. He shrugged. "You'd be surprised. People do stupid things." She didn't feel reassured. "Is there a back road I can take to get off this highway? I don't want to risk running into them again." The man nodded and pulled out a faded map from behind the counter. "There's an old farm road about a mile up the highway. It'll take you a bit longer, but it's quieter and safer." Lisa studied the map and memorized the directions. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced back at her car, reluctant to leave the relative safety of the gas station, but knowing she couldn't stay there all night. Before heading out, she grabbed a bottle of water and paid the attendant. "Drive safe," he said, his tone cautious. She nodded and returned to her car. As she got in, her eyes immediately darted to the rearview mirror. The parking lot was still empty. With a deep breath, she started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, carefully following the directions to the farm road. The road was indeed quieter, with no signs of headlights in either direction. Trees lined both sides, their tall silhouettes swaying slightly in the breeze. The stillness began to calm her nerves. But just as she rounded a bend, her headlights caught something on the side of the road, a single hubcap lying in the dirt. It glinted faintly in the light, looking as though it had been recently placed. Lisa's stomach churned. She pressed on, refusing to stop, but her thoughts raced. Was it from the truck? Was someone trying to lure her out of the car? For the next 10 minutes, the road remained empty. The soft hum of her tires on the pavement was the only sound. She started to believe she might make it home without further incident. But then, in her peripheral vision, she saw something in the rearview mirror, a flicker of headlights far behind her. Her chest tightened, the lights grew brighter and closer, and she recognized the unmistakable silhouette of the rusty truck. Lisa's grip on the wheel tightened. She accelerated slightly, her eyes darting between the road ahead and the truck behind her. But no matter how fast she went, the truck stayed at a steady distance, its headlights unwavering. It wasn't trying to pass her. It was following her again. Her pulse raced. Should she call for help? Try to find another gas station? Pull over and confront whoever it was? None of the options seemed safe. Ahead, she spotted a small intersection with a flashing yellow light. Without hesitation, she made a sharp left turn, her tires skidding slightly on the gravel. The truck hesitated for a moment before following. Lisa's mind raced as she navigated the narrow backroads. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever. Her gas tank was nearing empty. Desperation kicked in, and she began scanning the roadside for any signs of a house or another safe place to stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw a dim porch light glowing in the distance. It was a small farmhouse with a dirt driveway. Without thinking, she turned into it and parked near the house. The truck didn't follow. Instead, it slowed down near the entrance to the driveway, idling for a moment before driving off into the darkness. Lisa sat in her car, shaking, staring after the truck until its taillights disappeared. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified. After a few minutes, the porch light flicked on, and an older woman opened the front door, peering out cautiously. Lisa stepped out of the car and quickly explained what had happened. "You're lucky you stopped here," the woman said, her voice kind but firm. "This road's not safe at night. Too many stories about drivers going missing around these parts." Lisa didn't know what to say. She only nodded, her mind racing with questions about the truck and why it seemed to have vanished just as mysteriously as it had appeared. The older woman introduced herself as Martha and invited Lisa inside, sensing her fear. Lisa hesitated but agreed, feeling safer under the warm glow of the farmhouse lights than sitting alone in her car. Martha brewed a cup of tea and handed it to Lisa, who was still trembling. "You can stay here for the night if you'd like," Martha said. "It's not the first time someone's come knocking late at night on this road." "What do you mean?" Lisa asked, her voice still shaky. Martha sighed, sitting down across from her. "That stretch of Highway 99 has always been strange. People talk about being followed, feeling like someone's watching them. A few even claim to have seen that same old truck you described." Lisa's chest tightened. "Do you think it's someone local?" "Maybe," Martha replied cautiously. "But nobody's ever gotten a good look at the driver. They just seem to disappear once you leave the main road. You're lucky you turned off when you did." Lisa didn't sleep much that night, even in the safety of Martha's guest room. Every creak of the old farmhouse or rustle of the wind outside made her jump. By dawn, her exhaustion outweighed her fear, and she thanked Martha for her kindness before heading back to her car. As she drove away, the morning sun rising over the fields, Lisa noticed something unsettling in her rearview mirror. The scratches on her car door weren't just random, they formed a series of short lines. It looked like tally marks. Lisa's stomach churned. She drove directly to the nearest police station and reported the incident, showing them the marks on her car. The officer on duty listened carefully but didn't seem surprised. "We've heard stories like yours before," he admitted. "That truck's been reported a handful of times over the years, but there's no pattern. No license plate, no driver anyone's seen clearly. Some think it's a prank, others think it's something worse. But it always happens on that stretch of highway." "What should I do?" Lisa asked, her voice laced with frustration and fear. "Best advice? Avoid driving alone at night, especially on those back roads," the officer said. "And if you ever see that truck again, drive straight to the nearest public place, gas station, diner, anywhere with people." Lisa nodded, though the answer didn't bring her much comfort. As she left the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd narrowly escaped something far worse than a prank. She sold her car a few weeks later, unable to look at the tally marks without her skin crawling. Though she avoided Highway 99 from then on, she often found herself glancing nervously at her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck's headlights in the distance. And she couldn't help but wonder, if those were tally marks, how many others hadn't been as lucky? Mark Evans, a 32-year-old software engineer, had been driving south on Interstate 5 for hours, heading from Sacramento to San Diego for a work conference. It was late January, and the unusually heavy rain had turned the usually straightforward highway into a hazardous, waterlogged route. He had checked the weather before leaving and knew the storm would hit, but the deadlines at work left him no choice but to push through. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and the headlights barely illuminated the road ahead. At around 10 p.m., he passed through a less populated stretch of the highway, where exits were few and far between. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, an alert that his battery was at 5%. He cursed under his breath, realizing he had forgotten his charger at home. The rain seemed to intensify as he approached a construction zone. The bright orange cones and reflective signs warned of reduced lanes, and traffic funneled into a single lane. Mark slowed down to 40 miles per hour, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. That's when he noticed the car behind him. A black SUV, its headlights cutting sharply through the rain, was tailing him closer than made sense for such poor conditions. Mark glanced in his rearview mirror, annoyed but not alarmed. He tapped his brakes lightly, hoping the driver would back off, but the SUV didn't budge. Minutes passed, and the SUV stayed locked behind him, matching his every move. When the construction zone finally ended, Mark merged into the right lane, expecting the SUV to pass. But instead, it slowed down and stayed in the same lane, now keeping a distance but still following him. Mark's pulse quickened. He tried to brush off the unease, telling himself it was just a coincidence. But when he passed a sign indicating an upcoming rest area, he decided to pull off and see if the SUV would keep going. The rest stop was nearly empty, with just one semi-truck parked at the far end of the lot. Mark pulled into a space near the brightly lit vending machines and watched the highway through his rearview mirror. The SUV didn't follow him but instead slowed as it passed the exit, its taillights disappearing into the rain. Relieved, Mark leaned back in his seat, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He decided to take a quick break, stepping out to stretch his legs and grab a snack from the vending machine. As he stood under the flickering canopy light, his phone vibrated with a text from his colleague, Sarah. "Safe travels. Let me know when you get to the hotel." He typed back a quick response, watching his battery drop to 3%. Just as he turned back toward his car, he noticed headlights pulling into the rest area. His stomach sank as the black SUV rolled into the lot, parking 2 spaces away from his car. Mark climbed back into the driver's seat, locking the doors and pretending not to notice as he started the engine. The SUV's lights stayed on, its engine idling. For several long seconds, neither vehicle moved. Then, as Mark slowly began to back out of his space, the SUV did the same. His heart raced as he pulled back onto the highway. The rain made it harder to focus, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed again. He resolved to take the next exit, whether it led to a town, a gas station, or even another rest stop. 10 minutes later, he spotted a sign for a truck stop and turned off the highway. The SUV followed. Mark's mind raced with possibilities. Was this some sort of road rage incident? A random person trying to intimidate him? Or something more sinister? He pulled into the truck stop, a large, well-lit area bustling with late-night activity. Diesel engines rumbled as truckers refueled or parked for the night. Mark parked near the entrance to the convenience store and got out, this time heading straight inside without looking back. The cashier, a middle-aged man with a friendly demeanor, greeted him. "Rough night to be on the road, huh?" "You could say that," Mark replied, glancing out the large glass windows. The SUV was parked at the far end of the lot now, its lights off. "Everything okay?" the cashier asked, noticing Mark's nervous glance. "Not sure," Mark admitted. "That black SUV out there. I think they've been following me." The cashier frowned and nodded toward the back of the store. "We've got cameras all over the lot. You're safe here. Might want to grab a coffee and wait it out. Sometimes people leave if they think you're not alone." Mark nodded, grateful for the advice. He grabbed a cup of coffee and took a seat at a small table near the window, where he could keep an eye on the lot. The SUV stayed parked, unmoving. For the next 30 minutes, Mark debated his options. Should he call the police, wait until the SUV left, or just get back on the road and hope for the best? Finally, the SUV's headlights turned back on, and it pulled out of the lot, heading back toward the highway. Mark felt a wave of relief but stayed cautious. He waited another 20 minutes before returning to his car and continuing his journey. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but Mark couldn't shake the lingering unease. When he reached his hotel in San Diego, he parked in a well-lit spot near the entrance and checked in quickly. Before heading to his room, he glanced at his car one last time, half expecting to see the black SUV lurking nearby. It wasn't. But for the rest of his trip, Mark avoided driving at night and couldn't help but check his rearview mirror more often than usual, the unease from that night never fully leaving him. The next morning, Mark tried to shake off the strange events from the previous night. He had a busy schedule with his conference, and he didn't want to be distracted. But the feeling of being followed lingered in the back of his mind. During the day, he focused on his presentations and networking, hoping the long hours would help him forget. Yet, every time he checked his phone or glanced around, he couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease. That SUV still hadn't completely left his thoughts. Later that evening, after a long day of meetings, Mark decided to take a walk down the hotel street to clear his mind. He passed a few shops and restaurants, trying to relax, but the sense of tension was always there. He kept his phone in hand, scanning for any signs of the black SUV. When he returned to his hotel room, he felt paranoid, checking the parking lot before entering. The following day, after his final presentation, Mark had a few hours to kill before his flight back to Sacramento. He decided to drive around a bit, wanting to see more of San Diego before heading to the airport. As he drove through some of the more residential areas, he noticed something odd: the black SUV. It wasn't right behind him this time, but he caught a glimpse of it parked on the side of the street in his rearview mirror as he passed a quiet intersection. It was parked along the curb, seemingly abandoned. His pulse quickened, but he convinced himself it was just a coincidence. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. He took a few random turns, trying to lose the sense of being followed, but every time he looked in the rearview mirror, the SUV was there at a distance but unmistakably present. His anxiety began to build again. He pulled into the next gas station, a small one with a brightly lit convenience store. As he parked, he saw the SUV slowly pass by without stopping. It didn't pull in behind him, but it didn't leave either. It simply circled the block and then disappeared. Mark paid for his gas, trying to act normal, but every second felt like it stretched longer than it should. He couldn't understand what was happening. Was he just overthinking it? Or was he being followed for some reason he couldn't comprehend? Determined to get some answers, Mark decided to call the police. He described the situation, though he didn't feel it was a direct threat yet. The dispatcher took down his details, advising him to stay alert and report anything unusual, but she seemed unconvinced there was an immediate danger. Once back at the airport, Mark was finally able to breathe easier. He kept checking the lot as he made his way to the security line, but he didn't spot the SUV again. It was over, he convinced himself. That night, once back in Sacramento, Mark felt a sense of relief wash over him. He kept his phone by his side, just in case. It was the first time in days that he could rest without looking over his shoulder. The unease from San Diego had followed him for days, but now it seemed distant. He spent the next week focusing on his work, returning to his usual routine. He couldn't help but feel a subtle shift in his behavior, checking his rearview mirror more often, staying more aware of his surroundings when out driving. Still, the SUV was never spotted again, and the feeling of being watched faded, slowly at first and then completely. Months passed without incident, and Mark started to push the memory of the SUV out of his mind. He didn't know why it had followed him, or if it ever was following him at all. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But the unease remained in the back of his mind, reminding him to stay vigilant on the roads, no matter how quiet or calm they seemed. And every time he drove late at night, especially on long, lonely stretches of highway, his thoughts wandered back to that black SUV. He never did find out why it had been there, but he had learned one thing. In a world where everyone is in a hurry, sometimes there's more to the story than meets the eye. A few weeks later, Mark returned to his normal routine, though the unsettling experience on the highway still lingered at the back of his mind. He tried not to think too much about it, but every now and then, he'd find himself glancing at his rearview mirror, just a little more carefully than before. One afternoon, while at work, he received an email from his colleague, Sarah. She had forwarded a news article to him about a string of incidents involving drivers being followed on California highways. The article mentioned several similar reports, though none had been officially linked to one another. A pattern, however faint, seemed to be emerging drivers reporting feeling followed by a black SUV, always on isolated stretches of road. Mark froze when he read it. The description in the article matched his experience almost exactly: the same make, the same color, and the same eerie feeling of being trailed without clear reason. It was as if someone had been keeping tabs on him, even though he hadn't seen their face or heard a word. The article didn't provide any definitive answers or mention any recent developments in the investigation, but there was a suggestion that local authorities were looking into the issue. Mark decided to contact the police back in San Diego to see if they had any updates, though he didn't expect much. He had never reported it as an urgent or serious matter at the time, so he assumed the case was either dismissed or still in limbo. The officer on the phone listened intently, then paused. "Funny you mention that. Sir, we've had a few similar reports recently, people getting followed, strange cars showing up. But there's no hard evidence to go on, so we're not sure if it's connected to anything specific." Mark's stomach churned. "Do you think it could be a coincidence?" "It's possible, but we're taking it seriously," the officer reassured. "You did the right thing by reaching out. If it happens again or you feel unsafe, let us know immediately. Better safe than sorry." Mark hung up the phone, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He wasn't sure if he would ever get a clear answer about why he was targeted. But as the days passed, he started to feel like it was just a chapter in his life that he needed to close. A month later, Mark took another trip to Southern California for work. This time, he made sure to leave earlier, avoiding any late-night drives. He couldn't shake the feeling that the experience on the road had changed him somehow, but it was manageable now. Driving down the familiar stretch of Highway 5, he looked out at the landscape, trying to push the thoughts from his mind. He didn't see any black SUVs in his mirrors, nor did he feel the weight of anyone following him. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm that had eluded him during that anxious week months ago. Eventually, the fear subsided entirely, and the memory of the SUV faded into just another odd experience. Mark continued to travel for work, but he never forgot the strange events on the highway. In the end, he would never know whether he was actually being followed or if it had all just been his imagination running wild. But that was something he could live with. What mattered now was that he had learned to be more cautious, more aware of his surroundings, and that sometimes answers weren't as important as peace of mind. And with that, he finally let go.